Crystal chandeliers glimmered like captured stars above Charleston's most exclusive restaurant, their light spilling over velvet curtains and marble floors. Beyond the glass walls, the Atlantic crashed in restless waves. A rhythm no guest noticed, too busy drinking in power, money, and status. At the edge of it all stood Lila Harper, only 25, auburn hair escaping its knot, a faint scar running across her cheek like an unfinished story. Her shoes were worn, her apron frayed, yet her composure was unshaken. She wasn't just carrying plates tonight, she was carrying the crushing weight of her sister's leukemia treatments, the insurance rejection still burning in her pocket. From the corner table, billionaire Khalid Al-Mansour leaned back, eyes cold, his entourage gathered like vultures. When Lila placed a crystal glass before him, he muttered a sharp phrase in Arabic, lips curling into a smirk. A few guests who understood burst into cruel laughter. The rest followed without knowing why. The insult cut like glass, calling her beneath him, mocking her very presence. Evelyn, pearls flashing under the chandelier, whispered something nastier that sent the laughter rising higher. Lila's hands trembled for only a second before she stilled them against her apron. She raised her eyes, scar catching the light, but said nothing. Amir, the billionaire's young son, shifted uncomfortably, guilt flickering across his face. The room seemed to close in on her, mockery pressing like walls, stares daring her to break. Instead, Lila breathed in the salt air drifting from the sea and let the silence sharpen. They thought she was cornered. They thought she couldn't fight back. But what no one knew, not even Khalid himself, was that she had been waiting for this moment all her life. And when she finally answered, her words would flip the room upside down. What happened next would silence even the cruelest laugh. Charleston's evening unfurled with a blend of old-world charm and coastal mystery, the kind of night where the air carried salt from the nearby Atlantic, and the cobblestone streets seemed to hold secrets of centuries past. Lanterns flickered softly along the historic avenues, their light bending across palmetto trees that swayed gently in the sea breeze. Horse-drawn carriages rattled in the distance, mixing with the sound of laughter from rooftop bars and the faint cry of a gull that circled the harbor. This city, steeped in history, had a rhythm of its own, half-preserved elegance, half-restless tide. For most, it was beauty. For Lila Harper, it was survival. She hurried down a narrow side street leading to La Riviere, Charleston's most exclusive restaurant. Its entrance gleamed with polished brass doors, a doorman in a tailored suit bowing slightly as he admitted only the wealthy or those dressed well enough to belong. Lila wasn't among them, but she passed through anyway, her uniform granting her the invisible key. Inside, the atmosphere changed instantly. The salty tang of the sea faded into scents of butter, wine, and silk perfumes. Marble floors stretched like frozen rivers beneath silk tablecloths draped across heavy oak tables. Velvet curtains framed the expansive windows that opened toward the harbor, catching reflections of the chandelier light in their folds. Every surface seemed designed to whisper money. For Lila, the beauty carried no comfort. She had spent the entire day running from shift to shift, first at a cafe near the market, and then here, where demands were heavier and expectations crueler. Her hands trembled as she pulled her phone from her apron pocket while waiting behind the kitchen door. A new message glared back at her. Insurance claim denied. No further appeals. The words blurred as exhaustion and panic pressed at her eyes. Her sister, barely 17, was fighting leukemia. Treatments were already straining what little money they had. Now the denial letter meant choices too dark to imagine. Lila clenched the phone, fighting back tears. She couldn't fall apart. Not here, not in front of people who would laugh at weakness. She pushed the door open, stepping into the dining room once more. Conversations hushed slightly at her presence. Not out of respect, but for sport. Guests leaned toward each other, lips curling in whispers as their eyes caught her frayed apron strap and the faint scuff on her shoe. To them, she wasn't part of the elegance, but an intrusion tolerated only because she carried what they ordered. At the corner table, Khalid Al-Mansour sat with the kind of presence that filled the room even in silence. He was 50, broad-shouldered, his hair threaded with silver that only added to his aura of dominance. A gold watch gleamed at his wrist, and when he moved his hand, it was as though the gesture demanded attention. He spoke with an ease that suggested power had always bent to him. His words in English smooth, his Arabic sharper, carrying edges that cut unseen. Tonight he was surrounded by Charleston's elite politicians, socialites, business magnates drawn to him like moths to flame. Beside him sat Amir, his only son. At 23, Amir had the look of someone caught between two worlds. His dark eyes followed everything. His father's gestures, the guests' laughter, even the servers weaving through tables. Yet there was tension in the way he held himself, a stiffness that betrayed unease. When Khalid laughed too loudly, or Evelyn, the socialite draped in pearls, snapped her fingers for attention, Amir's fingers twitched on the stem of his wineglass, as though struggling with restraint. Evelyn herself was a fixture in Charleston's social scene. Mid-30s, she wore her pearls like armor, her lips painted in crimson that gleamed each time she smiled with calculated cruelty. Her voice carried through the room like a blade, sharp enough to draw blood from words alone. Tonight she had already found her target. As Leela set down a dish, Evelyn leaned across the table, eyes raking over the young waitress with amused disdain. "Do they allow aprons that frayed in a place like this?" she said, her tone loud enough for nearby tables to hear. Her companions chuckled, eager to display their alignment with her scorn. Leela pretended not to hear, her movements measured, but the heat at the back of her neck betrayed her effort. She adjusted the silverware, aligning each piece until it gleamed in perfect symmetry. It was her shield, precision against humiliation. Khalid joined in, his voice smoother but heavier. "Some places confuse service with charity," he remarked, eyes locked on Leela. "One would think exclusivity demands better." The remark stung not only because of its cruelty, but because of the ripple of laughter it sparked among his companions. His words, spoken with an effortless authority, carried weight that crushed without effort. Amir shifted again, his gaze flicking toward Leela, then away. His jaw tightened as though he wanted to speak but couldn't, or wouldn't, in front of his father. Instead, his silence became part of the room's complicity, another layer of pressure pressing down on her. The restaurant's beauty felt suffocating now, each crystal gleam and velvet fold a reminder of the gap between her world and theirs. Yet she held herself upright, the scar on her cheek catching the chandelier's glow, a faint mark of resilience they could not erase with laughter. She knew these nights they were battles fought without swords, only words and silences, each one leaving bruises no one saw. Another server brushed past her, whispering, "Ignore them, just keep moving." But Leela couldn't. Every word, every glance fed the storm building inside. She thought again of her sister, lying pale beneath hospital lights, of the letter that had turned hope into despair. The weight of it all balanced against the ridicule around her, pushing her closer to a breaking point she had learned to delay but could no longer avoid. The evening stretched on, each insult another stone in the wall closing around her. Evelyn continued her quiet jabs. Perhaps thrift shops are the new couture, while Khalid's remarks grew more cutting. He switched easily between English and Arabic, letting his sharper insults slip in a language most could not understand, as though that permitted him to strip her dignity unseen. But Leela understood every word. She placed another dish, her hands steady though her chest burned. Behind her eyes, memories flashed, nights studying Arabic grammar under the worn lamplight, her adoptive mother's encouragement, the dream of proving that knowledge was a weapon stronger than wealth. None of these people knew the battle she had already fought. They only saw a tired waitress. Yet in that moment, as Khalid's laughter filled the room and Evelyn's pearls glimmered with false light, something within Leela shifted. Her exhaustion, her grief, her humiliation, all of it tightened into resolve. She didn't speak yet, not with her lips, but in her silence, in the straightening of her spine and the fire sparking in her eyes. The first notes of defiance were already written. The setup was complete. The city outside whispered history, the restaurant glittered with wealth, and the players in this quiet war had taken their places. Khalid, the charismatic tyrant, wielding words as weapons. Evelyn, the sharp-tongued mocker, drawing blood with cruelty. Amir, the conflicted observer, torn between loyalty and conscience. And Leela, the scarred but unbroken waitress, standing alone at the edge of humiliation and revelation. The stage was set, and beneath the shimmer of chandeliers and the crash of distant waves, the story's tide began to turn. The laughter did not fade, it grew heavier, circling the room like smoke that refused to clear. Every clink of silverware seemed louder against the silence that followed Khalid's mocking tone. He leaned back in his chair, the curve of his smile cutting into Leila's composure like a blade, his words in Arabic drifting across the polished oak table. A servant pretending at grace, he had called her, clumsy, out of place, a stain against the glass she dares to touch. Few at the table understood the exact phrasing, but the tone, the sneer, needed no translation. Their laughter confirmed it. Evelyn leaned forward, pearls swaying against her neckline as she adjusted the napkin in her lap with exaggerated elegance. Her eyes flicked over Leela, narrowing in satisfaction. "Look at those shoes," she said in a voice dripping with mock sympathy. "Thrift store specials, surely. Isn't it tragic, Khalid, to watch ambition march in wearing rags?" Her companions tittered behind manicured hands, their gazes lingering on the scuffs at the edge of Leela's shoe as though the sight itself offered entertainment. Leela's breath caught, but she forced it steady. She pressed her fingers against the tray at her side, its polished metal cool against the sudden heat in her palms. Her silence was not surrender, though to them it looked like proof of her weakness. Inside, anger rose, pressing hard against her ribs. Yet her face remained calm, her eyes fixed on the table's arrangement. She adjusted a fork by half an inch, letting the motion serve as her reply. Precision, control, dignity. These were her armor. Khalid's smirk deepened. He turned toward his companions, then back at her, speaking again in Arabic, his tone deliberate, almost theatrical. "Do you see how she trembles?" he asked. "A bird in a storm, feathers ruffled, yet pretending she can fly." His voice carried over the table, and though most of the guests missed the meaning, the cadence and cruel sparkle in his eyes told enough. The laughter followed again, louder this time, a wave cresting over her. Amir shifted in his seat, the crystal stem of his glass twisting beneath his fingers. His gaze flickered to his father, then to Lila. His lips parted as though words might finally surface, but none came. Instead, he tightened his jaw, the conflict evident in the set of his shoulders. He raised his glass but did not drink, holding it like a shield against his own unease. Around them, the atmosphere thickened. The chandeliers glittered, throwing fractured light across velvet curtains and polished marble floors. But the beauty of the room seemed tainted now. Guests who were not part of the mockery still watched, some feigning indifference while others leaned closer, hungry for the next wound. Leela felt the weight of their eyes pressing against her skin, each glance another reminder of her place in their hierarchy. Her heart thudded once, heavy as Evelyn's voice rang out again. "Poor thing," she said, feigning pity. "Do you think she even understands what you're saying, Khalid? Or is she nodding along like a pet trained to smile?" The table erupted in chuckles, silver bracelets clinking as Evelyn lifted her wine. The laughter spilled outward, tugging more guests into the current, until it seemed the entire room trembled with ridicule. But Leela did understand. Every word. The cadence of Khalid's insults was familiar, its roots buried deep in years of study, nights spent under dim light poring over grammar and verse, her mother's encouragement echoing through memory. Their arrogance assumed her ignorance. Their laughter assumed her silence was emptiness. And for a moment the thought almost broke her, until something colder, sharper, steadier rose within. Her scar caught the light again as she lifted her chin, her eyes meeting Khalid's for the first time without flinching. She said nothing, but the fire in her gaze flickered strongly enough that he paused, his smirk faltering for only a fraction of a second. She held that silence like a blade, refusing to let it shatter. It wasn't surrender, it was the promise of something he hadn't foreseen. The laughter dimmed slightly, as though some instinct warned them of a shift. Evelyn, not sensing it, pressed forward. "Perhaps she thinks silence makes her mysterious," she said. "But really it only makes her look simple. Don't you agree?" She turned to Khalid, her smile demanding agreement. Khalid chuckled again, low and deliberate. "She's out of place," he said, this time in English, his accent lilting but his meaning unmistakable. "You cannot dress poverty in an apron and call it service. It is still poverty, clumsy and unfit." The words landed like stones, crushing any pretense of civility. A hush spread wider this time, though, creeping along the edges of the room. Not everyone laughed. Some shifted uncomfortably, their glasses lowered, their eyes darting between the billionaire and the young woman standing silent but unbroken before him. Leela noticed that flicker of discomfort, that hesitation. It told her the cruelty was beginning to fray. Her hands no longer trembled. She adjusted the tray against her hip, standing taller, her posture refined not by wealth but by sheer will. She breathed in deeply, the salt of the Atlantic still lingering in the air as though reminding her of strength older than the room, older than the man who mocked her. Amir finally set his glass down, the faint thud drawing his father's glance. His eyes lingered on Lila again, and for a moment his face softened, sympathy breaking through the mask he had been forced to wear. He wanted to speak, she could see it, but fear chained his words. Still, even that small gesture was enough. She was not entirely alone. Lila's silence remained, but it had changed. What began as restraint had become defiance, a refusal to bend. Each insult rolled off her not because it failed to hurt, but because she would not give them the satisfaction of seeing the wound. Her eyes gleamed with something they could not name, a resolve that unsettled even Khalid. The billionaire leaned back again, fingers drumming against the table. His smirk returned, though thinner now, less certain. He studied her as though trying to decipher a code hidden in her stillness. Evelyn filled the space again, chattering about appearances, about standards, her words sharp but increasingly hollow. The tide in the room was shifting, slowly but undeniably. In the shadows of laughter, something unspoken hung between Lila and her audience. She had not answered, not yet, but the air seemed charged with the expectation that she would. The cruelty had sharpened to its edge, but in pressing so hard, it had revealed the fracture in its own power. She inhaled once more, her shoulders straight, her gaze unwavering. Her silence was no longer an absence. It was a storm waiting to break. And for those watching, it was impossible not to wonder what would come when it finally did. Ever felt judged for who you are? Drop a comment below. It's how we connect. The room's laughter had become a rhythm, cruel and steady, echoing from the chandeliers down to the marble floor. It swelled with every remark, every sneer, each chuckle weaving itself into a chorus of derision. Khalid leaned back in his chair, his voice dripping with arrogance as he let another phrase fall in Arabic, sharper than glass. "She is nothing more than a servant fumbling in shadows," he declared, his tone mocking, confident no one here but a handful understood. His eyes glittered as he watched her place a glass at the table's edge. He wanted her silence, her humiliation. The sound struck deep, familiar enough to reopen old wounds. Leela's chest burned, but she held herself steady. She had endured so many nights of slights whispered and insults cloaked in polished tones. But this cut differently. Something in her refused to bend this time. For a moment she simply stood still, the tray balanced on her palm, her auburn hair slipping loose around her face. The chandelier's light caught her scar, a glint against her cheek like a sword unsheathed. Evelyn laughed the loudest, her pearls gleaming, her hand clutching Khalid's arm as if his mockery were her personal triumph. "You see?" she crowed, raising her voice so others turned toward them. "Even her silence proves it. She is nothing here, a decoration in rags, trembling for our amusement." The words were cruel, but they freed something inside Leela. Trembling gave way to stillness, and stillness to resolve. For weeks she had worked double shifts. For months she had swallowed humiliation. For years she had lived with others underestimating her. Tonight, in this gilded room, her sister's future, her own dignity, and her mother's lessons pressed against her ribs until the only choice left was release. She set the tray down gently, the silver barely whispering against the cloth. Straightening her spine, she turned fully toward Khalid, her eyes locking with his. The chatter dulled, curiosity rippling through the room as guests sensed a change in the air. When she spoke, her voice was steady, low at first but carrying through the hush like a clear note struck on glass. "You think I don't understand?" she said in flawless Arabic. Heads lifted in surprise, brows furrowed, and silence spread wider. Then, before the weight of her words could settle, she began. Her tone shifted, cadence rising into the music of poetry. "Raise your words, not your voice. It is rain that grows flowers, not thunder." The line, unmistakable to anyone versed in Persian and Arabic literature, hung in the room like a spell. Her pronunciation was perfect, every syllable touched with grace, the rhythm capturing the essence of Rumi's wisdom. Gasps rippled through the tables. Those who knew the poem sat stunned. Those who did not felt the power anyway, as though the language itself carried authority beyond translation. Khalid's smirk faltered, his jaw tensed, his eyes narrowing as if the chandelier light had turned too bright. He had intended humiliation. Instead, he had exposed himself. Leila continued, her voice gaining strength, the scar on her cheek gleaming with each turn of her head. "Be like a tree and let the dead leaves drop. The wound is the place where the light enters you." Each word was deliberate, each pause held with mastery. She was not just reciting, she was embodying. Her auburn hair brushed against her cheek as she turned, speaking not only to Khalid, but to every guest whose laughter had fed his cruelty. The cadence washed over them, commanding their attention, demanding their silence. The dining room had transformed. Moments ago it had been a stage for mockery, a theater of arrogance. Now it was a hall gripped by awe, every glittering surface reflecting her defiance. Glasses lowered midair, forks stilled halfway to mouths. Evelyn's lips parted, her laughter cut short into a stunned gape. Amir's eyes widened, his hand frozen around his glass, admiration breaking across his face like dawn. From the far end of the table, a professor visiting from Columbia, gray-haired and sharp-eyed, leaned forward, his hand pressing against the polished wood as if grounding himself in the moment. "Extraordinary," he whispered, then louder, his voice carrying reverence. "Her pronunciation is flawless, her cadence true poetry. This is no mimicry, this is mastery." The declaration rippled across the room. Guests shifted, eyes darting between the billionaire and the young waitress who had just silenced him with words older and stronger than his wealth. The balance of power tipped, subtle but undeniable. Khalid's face, once sculpted in control, betrayed the smallest crack. His smirk had vanished, his eyes flicking toward Leela with something that looked dangerously close to unease. He opened his mouth as if to reply, but the words caught, his throat dry beneath the weight of the silence that no longer belonged to him. Leela stood tall, her hands no longer trembling, her posture unshaken. She had not shouted, had not raised her voice, yet her words had carved through arrogance sharper than any blade. The chandelier's glow caught her scar, turning it into a mark of resilience rather than a flaw. For the first time tonight, she was not the subject of ridicule, but the bearer of command. She let the final line fall softly, almost tenderly, yet with the certainty of truth. Silence is the language of God. All else is poor translation. When the words ended, the hush that followed was absolute. No one laughed, no one mocked. The very air seemed to pause, suspended in awe and disbelief. For the first time, the tide of the evening had shifted entirely, and all eyes rested not on Khalid, not on Evelyn, not on wealth or pearls, but on the young woman with auburn hair and a scar that gleamed beneath the chandelier. In that silence, Lissalai did not smile. She did not bow or thank them for their sudden reverence. She simply stood, unshaken, her dignity unbroken, her presence undeniable. What had begun as humiliation had become revelation. The professor was the first to rise, his chair scraping back, his hand lifting as though to honor her. "A masterpiece," he said again, his voice rich with conviction. "You carry centuries in your tongue, young lady. You carry truth." The guests murmured now, not with ridicule but with respect, all lacing their voices. The balance of the evening was no longer in Khalid's grip. It belonged to the scarred waitress who had spoken like a poet, who had stood against laughter and answered with beauty. And for those watching, the question was no longer who is she to serve us, but who are we to mock her at all? The silence lingered like a held breath, so absolute it pressed against the chandeliers, the marble floor, even the velvet curtains that seemed to still their sway. Every sound had been swallowed by the echo of Leila's voice, the cadence of Rumi's lines reverberating inside each listener long after her lips had closed. The transformation was palpable. Moments ago, the dining hall had been a theater of ridicule. Yet now it felt like a cathedral, hushed beneath a revelation none had expected. Evelyn's hand twitched where it rested atop her wine glass. The pearls around her neck no longer shimmering with pride, but suffocating under the heat rising into her cheeks. Her face flushed a violent red, a mix of embarrassment and fury. She tried to summon her usual smirk, the one that sliced through rooms like a knife, but it faltered. The attempt at laughter caught in her throat, coming out as a nervous cough. She raised her glass to mask the tremor in her hand, though the crystal betrayed her with the faintest clink against the table. Amir's eyes told another story entirely. Wide, unblinking, they glimmered with something like awe. His chest rose and fell quickly as though he had been holding his breath during the entire recitation. He leaned forward, his elbows brushing against the polished wood, every trace of discomfort he had shown earlier replaced now by an undeniable admiration. His fingers, which had twitched restlessly on his glass, stilled at last. The corner of his mouth lifted, not into a full smile but into a subtle expression of respect, as if silently acknowledging her strength. The professor at the far end remained standing, his gaze fixed on Lila with the same intensity one might reserve for a work of art. His words of praise had already rung through the hall, but his presence alone, upright, reverent, added weight to the silence. Guests who moments ago had indulged in cruel laughter now found themselves whispering instead, voices low, reverent, uncertain. Words like extraordinary, flawless, and unbelievable rippled in hushed tones, each one a stone thrown against Khalid's dominance. Khalid himself, once so assured in his smirks and barbed phrases, sat unnaturally still. His hand drummed once against the table before curling into a fist, his knuckles pressing into the polished surface. His lips parted as though to reclaim authority, but the words stumbled before they reached the air. His throat bobbed with the effort to swallow back his hesitation. The chandelier's light, once a crown upon his presence, now seemed to burn against him, exposing the fragility beneath his arrogance. Finally, he forced a chuckle. The sound strained, unnatural. "A trick," he said, switching to English as though clinging to control. His voice was lower, less commanding, carrying a tremor he could not quite conceal. "A memorized trick. Nothing more. She parrots words she barely understands, like a child repeating prayers without meaning." But the conviction was absent. The faltering edge in his tone betrayed him, and those gathered felt it. Whispers swelled stronger now, threads of doubt weaving across the room. Guests glanced at one another, unsure, some daring to shake their heads subtly. The professor's jaw tightened at Khalid's dismissal, and he spoke again, this time with authority, sharpened by disdain. "Do not diminish what you cannot comprehend. That was not mimicry. That was mastery born of discipline and heart." The declaration cracked what little facade Khalid had left. He shifted in his seat, his cufflinks catching the light as though mocking him. For years he had lived in the ease of power, every room bending toward his confidence. Tonight, however, the tide had turned, and the weight of every whisper pressed against his shoulders. Evelyn, desperate to recover ground, leaned forward with a brittle laugh. Perhaps she learned one poem well enough to impress an audience, she said, her voice sharp but lacking its usual venom. Anyone can recite lines when coached. Her words floated weakly, clashing against the awe still woven into the air. The lack of response around her left her cheeks burning brighter. She lifted her glass again, draining it in a graceless swallow, her pearls rattling faintly against the crystal. Lila had not moved during any of this. She stood tall, her auburn hair catching glimmers of gold in the chandelier's glow, her scar gleaming like a badge of resilience. Her silence now was different from before. It was no longer misinterpreted as weakness but recognized as control. She needed no rebuttal, no effort to defend what the room had already seen. The strength in her posture spoke louder than any words Khalid could muster. Amir's gaze lingered on her still. He leaned closer, lowering his voice enough that only those beside him might hear. Yet the sincerity carried weight. "Incredible," he whispered, the words slipping free despite his father's presence. It was not meant for approval from others. It was meant for her. And though Lila did not acknowledge it directly, the flicker of gratitude in her eyes revealed she had heard. Whispers continued to ripple across the tables. Some spoke in awe, recounting fragments of her recitation, while others exchanged knowing looks that betrayed their shifting allegiances. Power, once tightly bound to Khalid's presence, now bled into the space around Lila. Even those who dared not openly voice it could feel the change. The room had turned, its loyalty unsettled, its hierarchy disrupted. Khalid's hand twitched toward his wine, but when he raised the glass, his fingers shook enough for the movement to betray him. He forced another smile, baring his teeth like a man trying to reclaim ground already lost. "A performance," he insisted again, though his voice cracked slightly, Nothing more than a servant desperate for attention. But no one laughed this time. The echoes of ridicule that once filled the hall had been replaced by murmurs of dissent, by respect swelling for the young woman he had tried to crush. Evelyn's attempts at mockery fell flat. Khalid's words rang hollow, and the guests began to look at one another as if silently questioning why they had ever joined the cruelty in the first place. Leela finally allowed herself a slow breath. Her chest rose and fell, steady and calm, as though the storm had passed through her and left her unshaken. She did not smile in triumph. She did not gloat. Instead, she stood dignified, her silence speaking volumes. For every guest watching, that silence became proof. It was not Khalid who controlled this room anymore. It was her. The professor lowered himself back into his chair at last, though his eyes never left Leela. His respect lingered in his gaze, etched deep, as though he had witnessed a moment that would live far beyond the night. Amir's admiration burned quietly, Evelyn's humiliation festered, and Khalid's authority frayed, thread by thread beneath the weight of his own faltering voice. The chandeliers still glittered, the ocean still crashed against Charleston's harbor outside, yet nothing in this room was as it had been. What began as mockery had transformed into revelation, and every witness felt the shift. Seen someone defy expectations? Share their story below. Let's celebrate their strength. The room did not slide back into comfort. Conversations resumed in thin threads, cautious and brief. Lila kept her place by the corner table, light pooling on her cheek. The professor watched her. Evelyn stared into her glass. Khalid held very still. Amir's gaze stayed on Lila, steady now. Lila slipped a hand into her apron with unhurried grace. The motion was small, yet it gathered the room's attention. Her fingers found a sheet of paper worn thin at the folds. She held it a heartbeat, then drew it into the light. The page belonged to late buses, cheap coffee, and stubborn hope. I did not learn to speak for applause, she said. I learned to speak to live. She lifted the paper slightly. This letter is why. In a moment. She unfolded the page and read clearly, without theatrics. Miss Leela Harper, it is our pleasure to confirm your placement in the Advanced Arabic and Comparative Poetics track, under Professor Amina Al-Jaber, the renowned linguist. Your essays show rare acuity, and your phonetic transcriptions reveal a musical ear. With sponsorship from the Al-Mansour International Scholars Fund, tuition and books for the first year are covered. We expect excellence and promise mentorship worthy of your potential. The air tightened, several faces turned toward Khalid. Leela lowered the page. I had no map, she said softly. I had this in a mother who taught me that words are tools and shelter. I had a sister who needed me to become more than tired hands. Professor Amina Al-Jaber took what I brought and forged discipline from it. She corrected my accent until I heard the difference between imitation and truth. After late shifts, I practiced until the hallway lights dimmed. The professor at the table nodded. Amina is relentless and right. Leela's mouth softened. When my adoptive mother died, I vanished for a week. Amina found me outside a locked classroom and sat with me through the night. She told me, you may rest, but you may not abandon your voice. When my sister's diagnosis arrived, I tried to return the award. She refused the envelope and said the point of a door is to stay open when it matters most. Evelyn shifted, pearls suddenly heavy. Leela held the sheet so the nearest guest could see the crest at the top. Embossed letters caught the light. Al-Mansour International Scholars Fund. Underneath, a familiar flourish closed the signature. Khalid paled. He had approved many grants, this one returned with a witness. Amir rose before he knew he was standing. His chair whispered across the marble. He stared at the crest, then at his father, then at Leela, as if the focus ring of his life had snapped into clarity. There are many beneficiaries, Khalid said at last, reaching for hauteur and finding air. We support talent everywhere. I cannot be expected to remember each name. The claim rattled. Memory offered him a short list he had initialed beside a note from Amina praising a waitress who heard cadence like architecture. Leela stepped nearer, not to corner him but to complete the truth. You signed a promise, she said. I kept mine. I studied. I worked. I learned to carry poems as carefully as dishes. The same name you mocked opened a door your pen paid to build. The professor exhaled a small laugh. A circle closes, he murmured. Khalid's hands fell to his sides. Authority slipped an inch. Around the tables, whispers changed color from awe to recognition. The letter moved like a current, revising the room's belief about who stood where. Leela folded the sheet along its weary seam and returned it to her apron. When she looked up, Amir was already moving. He came around the curve of chairs, leaving behind the comfort of spectatorship. He stopped at a respectful distance, shoulders lowered, palms visible. I'm sorry, he said, voice low but clear. I heard my father. I heard the laughter. I said nothing. That silence was mine. She studied his face. He did not flinch. It wasn't your insult, she answered gently. He opened his arms a fraction, not performing, simply offering. The room held its breath. Liza stepped forward and allowed a brief embrace, careful and warm, measured like a vow. It lasted a second, yet it remade the space. Cruelty had been public, so was grace. Evelyn looked aside, unable to parse tenderness. Amir returned to his chair, different from the man who had risen. The professor lifted his hand, requesting the letter. Liza placed it in his palm. He read quickly, then tapped the signature. Every stroke of a pen carries an address, he said. Eventually a letter finds its way back. Khalid absorbed the rebuke without protest. He had come to be admired and found a ledger instead. He studied Liza as if measuring an equation, whose variables no longer obeyed him. She met his gaze without heat. I'm returning to work, she said. My sister still needs medicine. The kitchen still needs plates. The letter passed from the professor to other hands. Each person traced the crest, read the name, and felt something shift inside. The chandeliers kept glowing. The ocean kept striking the harbor beyond the glass. Yet the definition of wealth had changed. A voice trained in scarcity, a mentorship kept, a signature remembered by the life it enabled. Khalid pressed his palms together, perhaps in thought, perhaps in prayer. He looked at the young woman he had belittled, and saw at last that nothing could be taken from her by saying less. The professor folded the letter neatly and returned it to Lidla with a small bow. She tucked it away and drew a breath that steadied the evening. The head server emerged from the kitchen, uncertain, then took his cue from her poise and nodded to the staff. Service resumed, quieter, cleaner. Trays moved without clatter. Voices lowered. The room relearned its manners. Amir watched his father, then looked back at Lidla. He lifted his glass in a modest salute meant for her alone. She did not return the gesture with show. She answered with the smallest hint of a smile and turned to collect a setting. The scar along her cheek caught the light again. No longer a flaw but a line in a map. Outside, a gull tilted against the wind. Inside, plates settled. Silver found its order, and the night resumed at a different altitude. People would tell this story later, each adding a detail, each remembering the moment the letter appeared and the room changed. Some would praise the poem, some would praise the courage. A few would quietly reconsider what their signatures meant. Lila moved through the tables with calm efficiency. She did not hurry. She did not shrink. She belonged to herself, to her craft, to a promise shepherded through hardship. When she reached the corner again, she paused, glanced at the ocean's dark line, and let the hush settle under her skin like certainty. The worst had been spoken. The truth had answered. The rest of the night would be work, and work at last felt like power. The night did not end in the dining room. Its echoes spilled outward, carried by whispers, retellings, and, most fatefully, the lens of a phone that had trembled in the hands of one curious guest. At first the footage was unsteady, shaky frames of chandeliers, glimpses of crystal glasses, but then it sharpened. The camera captured Lila standing straight, her scar illuminated, her voice delivering Rumi's words in flawless Arabic. The room's laughter falling silent became a spectacle in itself. That clip, barely 2 minutes long, left the restaurant before dessert had even been served. By dawn it appeared on X under the caption, "When a billionaire mocked a waitress, her reply left the room frozen." Within hours it was shared thousands of times. By afternoon the view count surged past 1 million. By nightfall the entire world seemed to have leaned closer, replaying the moment where power shifted not through money but through language, courage, and truth. Comments poured in. Some praised her mastery of Arabic. "Her pronunciation is better than mine and I was born into it." Others admired her composure. She stood taller than any chandelier in that room. Still others drew parallels to their own lives. "I've been underestimated like this. Watching her makes me believe I can stand tall too." The hashtags multiplied. Resilient waitress, poetic justice, underdog power. Memes followed, pairing Khalid's stunned face with captions about arrogance meeting reality. The effect on Khalid was immediate and devastating. For years his reputation had been a fortress built on wealth, charm, and intimidation. Yet no fortress withstands a viral storm. Clips of his smirk collapsing circulated on business forums, investors retweeting the video with cautionary words about arrogance and optics. Within a week, 2 major deals slipped through his grasp. A European energy partnership quietly withdrew, citing public relations concerns. An American tech firm paused negotiations indefinitely. His empire, once insulated, found itself cracking under the pressure of ridicule, amplified by millions of strangers. Reporters dug further. They uncovered patterns, former employees speaking anonymously about his cruelty, partners recalling his dismissive tone. The video had opened a door no one dared touch before. Now the world walked through freely. Khalid's name, once polished, grew tarnished in headlines. He tried to issue statements about misunderstanding, cultural differences, context lost in translation, but the footage needed no interpreter. The image of a billionaire silenced by a waitress wielding poetry was too clear, too potent. Evelyn's decline was subtler but equally relentless. Invitations that once flooded her calendar dwindled. At first she brushed it off, telling herself Charleston's elite would forget. But the internet never forgets. Clips of her sneer, her words about thrift store shoes, circulated alongside mocking hashtags. Fashion bloggers roasted her pearl necklace as a symbol of outdated cruelty. A charity gala rescinded her speaking role. A luxury brand she endorsed quietly removed her photo from their campaign. Her calls went unanswered, her texts unreturned. For a woman who thrived on social currency, invisibility was the sharpest exile. Meanwhile, Logilla returned to work. She did not abandon the restaurant or transform overnight into someone else. She continued carrying trays, arranging silverware, adjusting glasses, yet the air around her had changed. Patrons who once glanced past her now lowered their eyes with respect, some even offering quiet words of apology. Regular customers tipped more generously, not out of pity but admiration. Staff members followed her lead instinctively, sensing that dignity flowed from her presence. Her sister watched the video from her hospital bed, eyes wide with wonder. "You sounded like a queen," she whispered, voice weak but threaded with pride. Lila kissed her forehead gently. "I just sounded like myself," she answered, though inside she carried the strength of knowing her sister now believed hope had form and voice. The professor who had praised her wrote a column for an academic journal. He dissected her performance with scholarly rigor, explaining how cadence, diction, and confidence revealed not mere memorization but deep fluency. The article went viral in its own sphere, further dismantling Khalid's attempt to call her act a trick. Scholars across continents referenced the column, noting how dignity in language could topple arrogance in an instant. Amir, too, became part of the ripple. A photo circulated online, him rising from his chair, his face lit with admiration. Caption writers called him the son who saw. Some criticized him for not speaking sooner. Others commended his eventual stand. Regardless, his reputation separated from his father's shadow. He reached out quietly to Layla through the professor, sending a handwritten note. "I was silent when I should not have been. Thank you for teaching me that words are worth courage. I hope one day to speak as you did." Charleston itself buzzed with the story. Tour guides began pointing out Le Louvre as the place where arrogance was silenced. Locals debated it at cafes, blending pride with reflection. Young waitstaff in other restaurants whispered her name like a banner of resilience. The city's historic charm now carried a fresh tale, one not of cobblestones or lanterns, but of a woman who had turned humiliation into triumph. Through it all, Layla remained grounded. She kept her head bowed in quiet gratitude, refusing offers from talk shows and reality producers. She did not seek fame, though fame had already found her. What mattered was her sister's treatment, her mother's lessons, the steady rhythm of work that gave her life structure. Yet she could not deny that something had shifted inside her. She walked with greater calm, her silence now commanding space rather than surrendering it. The viral clip continued to climb. 5 million views, 10 million, then 20. Celebrities reposted it with messages of solidarity. Teachers used it in classrooms to spark discussions about prejudice and resilience. Activists cited it during speeches about dignity and inequality. The ripple had grown into a wave touching shores she had never seen. Khalid retreated from the spotlight. His appearances grew scarce, his empire weakened. Evelyn faded into irrelevance, her pearls remembered only as the symbol of a sneer undone. Yet Leela endured, not as an icon she claimed, but as a woman who had lived honestly in her truth. One evening, as she left the restaurant under Charleston's lantern glow, a teenager approached shyly with a phone in hand. "You don't know me," she said nervously, "but I watched your video 100 times. People laughed at me for how I talk, for where I come from. Seeing you, it made me believe I can answer back too." Leela smiled, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Then you already have," she whispered. The story had become larger than her, but its heart remained simple. Dignity survives, truth echoes, and strength often wears the quiet face of an underdog. Know an underdog who triumphed? Tag them below. Let's honor resilience. Charleston's night carried a hushed beauty, the kind that lingered long after the laughter of restaurants faded and the tide pulled back into the dark harbor. Gaslit lanterns flickered along the cobblestone streets, their amber glow stretching into shadows that danced over palmetto trees and iron-wrought balconies. The air was cool, salty, touched with jasmine drifting from hidden gardens. It was a city steeped in history, yet alive in every step, and tonight it seemed to walk beside Leela Harper as she made her way home. Her shoes scuffed softly against the stones, the same shoes Evelyn once ridiculed, though now they felt like old friends carrying her forward with dignity. She kept her head high, auburn hair loosened from its knot, the scar along her cheek catching slivers of lantern light like a constellation etched in skin. The events of the evening mockery, defiance, revelations still echoed within her, but she carried them quietly. She did not need applause, nor did she crave validation. The strength she had shown belonged to her alone, rooted in years of labor, loss, and resilience. As she walked, the memory of her adoptive mother returned vividly, as if the night itself had conjured her presence. She remembered sitting at the small kitchen table years ago, a chipped lamp glowing while her mother whispered wisdom between sips of tea. "Words are more than sounds," she had said. "They are bridges or blades." They can wound, or they can heal. Choose them as carefully as you choose who you trust. Lissa had been young, restless, and uncertain of her future, but those lessons had carved themselves deep. Tonight they had bloomed. She had answered cruelty, not with thunder but with rain, her mother's voice guiding her unseen. The rhythm of the ocean drifted faintly from the harbor, its crash against the seawall steady and eternal. She paused near an alley where the lantern's glow dimmed, staring up at Charleston's night sky. Stars broke through the coastal haze, scattered like embers of 1,000 untold stories. She let the sight steady her breathing, anchoring herself in the knowledge that her life, though unchanged on the surface, now carried ripples far beyond what she could see. Footsteps pattered lightly behind her. She turned and saw a young girl, no more than 12, approaching with hesitant grace. The child's hair curled in loose spirals around her shoulders, her dress faded but clean, her eyes wide with a mix of admiration and nervousness. She held a sketchbook clutched to her chest, its edges frayed. "Are you the lady from the video?" the girl asked softly, her voice almost swallowed by the night. Lila smiled, a quiet curve of lips that carried warmth rather than pride. "I am," she answered, "though I'm still just a waitress." The girl shook her head firmly, stepping closer. "Not to me." She opened her sketchbook and turned it toward Lila. On the page, drawn in pencil with surprising detail, was the figure of a woman standing beneath a canopy of stars, her hair flowing, her scar shining like a mark of courage. The lines were rough but heartfelt, the proportions imperfect yet alive. It was not just a picture, it was an echo of what the girl had seen in her heart. Lila felt her breath catch, emotion rising in her throat. She reached out and touched the edge of the page lightly, careful not to smudge the graphite. "You drew this?" The girl nodded. "I watched your video with my mom. People laugh at me at school because I talk differently. They call me names, and I never know what to say back. But when I saw you, when I saw how you stood there, and how you spoke, I wanted to remember it. I wanted to draw it so I don't forget." Tears pricked at the corners of Lila's eyes, but she blinked them away, choosing steadiness instead of collapse. She knelt so her gaze met the girl's directly. "Do you know what this drawing means?" she asked. The girl frowned slightly, unsure. "It means you already have the courage inside you," Lila said gently. "You turned a moment into art. You took strength and gave it form. That's more powerful than the cruelest words anyone can throw." The girl's lips parted, her face softening into a shy smile. She closed the sketchbook slowly, holding it close to her chest again as though it were a treasure. "Will you keep walking like that? Strong, like in my drawing?" Lila nodded. "As long as you promise to keep drawing, because that's how you'll keep walking too." The girl giggled faintly, then wrapped her arms around Lila's waist in a quick, unexpected hug before darting back toward the street where a woman waited, likely her mother, watching with grateful eyes. The sketchbook still hugged to her chest. The girl vanished into the glow of another lantern. Lila straightened again, the city's quiet folding around her. That simple exchange had cut deeper than any headline, any viral post. This was the truth of impact, not the millions of views, not the collapsing empire of a billionaire, but one child believing she could be more than mockery. One girl holding a sketch of resilience beneath the stars. She resumed her walk, her mind weaving between past and present. She thought of her sister, fighting her illness with the same stubborn strength, waiting for her at home. She thought of the professor, who had seen her and named her mastery. She even thought of Amir, whose apology had carried sincerity despite his father's shadow. All of them were threads in a tapestry she hadn't known she was weaving. The city stretched onward, its gaslit lanterns flickering like constellations at her feet. She moved slowly, savoring the rhythm of quiet. Tonight she felt both smaller than the world and greater than her burdens. Her life was not fixed, not freed from hardship, but it was lit with a flame that could not be extinguished by insult or arrogance. At the corner of Broad and Meeting, she paused once more, her hand brushing the wrought iron railing of an old church fence. Her mother's voice returned to her again. "The world is loud, but your silence can be louder if you fill it with strength." She let the memory warm her as she turned toward home, her figure framed by the lantern's glow, her scar bright as a compass. Behind her, the ocean continued its eternal rhythm, as if applauding softly against the seawall. Ahead of her, the path was uncertain but hers to walk. She carried no banners, sought no crowns. She carried words, dignity, and the quiet certainty of a life shaped not by wealth or cruelty, but by resilience. What moment shaped you? Share it below, it binds us. The storm that began inside the gilded walls of La Riviere had stretched far beyond Charleston's streets. It had traveled across continents, screens glowing with the same 2 minutes of footage. A young waitress answering a billionaire, not with fury but with words polished like diamonds. By now the video had crossed 40 million views, and every replay was another ripple in the tide she had unintentionally created. On X, the comment threads read like a choir of recognition. She shut him down with class. One post declared, gathering 500,000 likes. "This is how dignity sounds," wrote another, shared by teachers to their students. "I felt this in my bones," confessed a user from Canada. From the UK, someone added, "She turns silence into power. Never seen anything like it." The post multiplied, reshared with captions that stitched her defiance into universal memory. But while the world admired, Leela continued with her life in rhythms familiar to her. She wiped down polished oak tables. She carried trays heavy with crystal glasses. She walked home beneath lantern-lit streets, the scar on her cheek catching shadows as it always had. Fame did not feed her, nor did it heal her sister. Yet respect had settled into her world in ways more enduring than fleeting praise. One evening, a coworker named James, a dishwasher with sleeves rolled to his elbows and years of unnoticed labor behind him, approached her quietly in the kitchen. Steam rose from the sinks, the clang of pans echoing. He hesitated, drying his hands on a worn towel. "I've worked here 10 years, he said, voice rough from soap and silence. "Nobody ever looked at me like I mattered. But when you spoke that night, you didn't just speak for yourself. You spoke for people like me. For all of us who carry this place without thanks." Leela turned, surprise softening into gratitude. She touched his arm gently. "I didn't mean to speak for anyone," she admitted. "I only meant to stand." James shook his head. "Sometimes standing for yourself stands for others too." His eyes held sincerity, and in that moment she realized her defiance had become shared armor for those who had no stage to reveal their strength. A few days later, a familiar face appeared at one of her tables, a regular customer, Mrs. Whitaker, who had dined at La Riviere every Friday for years. She was elderly, always draped in shawls that smelled faintly of lavender. Tonight her eyes shone brighter than usual as she clasped Leela's hand when the glass of water was set before her. "My dear," she said softly, voice trembling but firm, "I saw the video. Everyone had. But when I watched, I didn't see a waitress or a billionaire or a chandelier. I saw my younger self. 50 years ago, I was underestimated in every room I walked into. People told me I wasn't fit, wasn't worthy. I never dared to answer. Watching you was like healing an old wound I thought would never close." Leela's throat tightened. She squeezed the woman's hand. "You're stronger than you believe," she whispered. Mrs. Whitaker smiled faintly, eyes damp. "And so are you. Never let them take that away." Moments like these grounded her more than the millions of anonymous likes. It was here, in the quiet acknowledgement of coworkers and regulars, that she understood the actual impact of her defiance. It was not only a viral moment, it was a mirror for those who had once bowed their heads under ridicule. The online world, however, continued to surge. Entire threads unfolded where people shared their own stories of being underestimated. A student in Australia wrote about teachers who told him he would fail, yet he had graduated top of his class. A nurse in Canada described being mocked for her accent, only to rise as head of her department. A young mother in New York posted about walking away from a toxic marriage, captioning her photo, "Silence can be louder than thunder." Each story piled onto the next, a collective chorus of resilience born from the spark of one night in Charleston. News anchors replayed the clip during primetime broadcasts, dissecting the symbolism. Social commentators wrote op-eds about dignity in the service industry, about arrogance unmasked, about the poetry of defiance. Late-night hosts played the video, audiences cheering as Khalid's smirk disappeared. And while Khalid withdrew from the public eye, his empire losing ground, Leela never sought to replace him. She had not spoken for profit or fame. She had spoken because silence could no longer hold the weight of insult. That difference made all the difference. In Charleston, the restaurant carried a new reputation. Patrons arrived not only for the food but for the story, whispering to each other as they glanced at the waitress moving with calm grace between tables. Some asked for photos, most settled for simply watching in quiet admiration. The staff protected her, ensuring she was not overwhelmed. Yet Leela handled each approach with the same humility. A nod, a thank you, a gentle smile. Her sister's treatments continued, now funded by donations that poured in after strangers launched a campaign in her name. Letters arrived from across the world, handwritten notes of gratitude, sketches, poems, even books from scholars who wished to honor her fluency. Among them was a package from Professor Amina Al-Jaber herself, filled with annotations on new works, a personal note scrawled in the margins, "Never stop, the world listens now, but more importantly, so does your heart." At night, when the city's lanterns glowed and the ocean hummed against the seawall, Leela allowed herself moments of reflection. She remembered the mockery, the silence, the words that had shifted everything. She remembered her mother's lessons, her sister's fragile smile, Amir's quiet apology, James's gratitude, Mrs. Whitaker's trembling voice. All of it wove together into something larger than a viral video. It had become a testament to the endurance of dignity, proof that even the most ordinary life could carry extraordinary strength. And still, she never claimed to be extraordinary. She was a woman who worked, who carried plates, who paid bills, who loved her sister. She was no hero draped in crowns. She was simply herself, scarred, tired, resilient. That was enough. Online, the movement continued to swell. Hashtags turned into campaigns celebrating overlooked workers, students, and underdogs. People found the courage to tell their own stories, emboldened by hers. Each post, each retweet, each whispered acknowledgement added to a chorus that stretched across borders. For Leela, the lesson was not that she had won, but that truth spoken at the right time carried further than she could measure. She had become a vessel for something universal, the hunger to be seen, to be heard, to be respected. And so as the story closed on Charleston's lantern-lit streets, it opened in countless other places, cafes, hospitals, classrooms, homes, where underdogs realized they too carried strength waiting to be voiced, felt the sting of being underestimated. Hit like, share your story, and follow to walk through courage and truth together.